Isaiah Berlin, of course, the great founder of our college and philosopher and historian of ideas. Amy, as many of you will know, is the Christopher H. Browne Distinguished Professor of Political Science and also Professor of Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. Before that, from 2022 to 2024, she was US Ambassador to Germany, and before that, she was the president of the University of Pennsylvania, serving in that position from 2004 till 2022, so quite a stretch. Her academic career is equally illustrious. Her writings have focused on the key values of democratic societies and ways to step over from theory into policy. Her 1987 book, Democratic Education, asked how a democratic society should educate its young people. Is it valid to instill patriotism? How do we tackle a very diverse student population? In 1996, she published Democracy and Disagreement, which made the case for political debate which avoids polarization and encourages reason. And then in 2003, she published Identity in Democracy, which talks about the ways in which individual uniqueness and the unity of groups are not mutually exclusive and indeed are absolutely necessary for robust societies. Well, the autocratic turn in some of our democracies, and especially the challenges those administrations pose to independent research and speech in our universities, well, these are some of the biggest issues anyone involved in education today faces. And they are, I'm sure, issues on which Isaiah Berlin himself would have extremely strong views. So please join me in welcoming Ambassador Gutmann to the stage.
Thank you so much, Sir Tim, and thank you to the fellows of Wolfson College for inviting me here to speak in honor, to speak and to honor one of my true intellectual icon heroes, Sir Isaiah Berlin. So my topic today, democracy in distress, is a big one, and I started in a small place. Specifically in the back seat of an armored Audi A8 sedan, tearing down the German Autobahn on a blustery gray day in February 2022. It seems that long ago. Surrounded by briefing papers, I glanced up at the speedometer and noticed we were doing 180 kilometers per hour. I don't have to translate that to you, but for any Americans, that's about 112 miles per hour, US equivalent in our crazy non-metric system. It was my first week as US ambassador to Germany. I was on an urgent diplomatic mission heading from Berlin to the Munich Security Conference to join Vice President Harris, Secretary of State Blinken, at the conference, and we made it with no time to spare. Russian President for Life Putin was preparing to launch a brutal and illegal war to overrun Ukraine, our democratic ally. The first expansionist ground war in Europe since World War II was about to erupt. Putin, in addition to commanding one of the world's largest armies, had leverage over Europe's largest economic power. Germany had become dependent on Russia for its gas and energy. Could Putin blackmail Germany into neutrality, a disastrous outcome for the security and freedom of Ukraine, Europe, and the United States? Could we convince Olaf Scholz, the new German chancellor at the time, of the imminent danger? To protect the freedom and security of sovereign democracies, we needed Germany to stand strong with us against Putin in support of Ukraine. This was a classic just and unjust war situation. Ukraine was clearly defending its right to exist. Ours was an urgent, tough love message. End your dependency on Russian gas and oil. Build your military defenses. And I delivered this message with the fulsome support of the American government. I also felt a strong personal and ethical stake in ensuring its success. You see, my upbringing is a story of the destructive weight of autocracy, the redeeming power of democracy, and the urgency of the moment. And speeding down the Autobahn at 180 kilometers an hour is still for us today an apt metaphor. For now as then, we have no time to spare. I am the only child of a generation of German Jews who fled Nazi Germany. My father, Kurt Gutmann, died suddenly of a heart attack when I was just in high school. Prior to then, and for many years later, I had a very traumatic connection to Germany. When I was no more than 7 years old, my father told me the story of his early life, sparingly but very directly. It was 1934, a year after Hitler came to power, and Kurt Gutmann was a 23-year-old metalworking apprentice in Nuremberg. He had come from his hometown, the nearby Feuchtwangen, to the big city to learn a trade. He was boarding with a Christian family, and they treated him well. One day, a Nazi parade wound through Nuremberg. Many city residents turned out to watch the procession. Families joined their neighbors in raising their hands in the Nazi salute. A young Jewish man looked out the window, his gaze fixed on one family, the family with whom he was boarding, standing on the street with their arms outstretched. That young man was my father, who understood in an instant that he had to leave Germany. My father, Kurt Gutmann, was the youngest of 5 children in an observant Jewish family that traced their German ancestry back to the 1700s. He told his family that the terrible things already happening in Germany would only get worse. But he couldn't convince them to join him. So alone he fled to India. It was the only place he could find refuge. The United States was not open to him. Great Britain was willing to give him citizenship to live in India, then a colonial part of Great Britain. The years passed and the evil intensified. The Nazis sent 2 of my uncles to Buchenwald concentration camp. Nazi stormtroopers, supported by townspeople, trashed my grandparents' store and threatened their lives. Somehow, between 1937 and 1939, my father managed to arrange all their passages to join him in India. Although I've learned a lot since being ambassador, thanks to the German archives, it is a mystery as to how he got them out. Starting as a child, I boycotted all things German. It was an unspoken understanding in my home. But over time, Germany became a stable, reunified democracy committed to a remembrance culture and welcoming refugees from other countries. It now has the largest number, and when I was ambassador, it had the largest number of Ukrainian refugees in Germany, and many others as well, from the Middle East and other parts of the world. Unlike the first generation of post-World War II Germans, following generations owned up to the evil of their past, something my father never lived to see, and my relationship to Germany changed. As U.S. ambassador beginning in 2022, I launched a Stand Up and Speak Out for Democracy initiative, partnering with groups throughout Germany. We spoke up against anti-Semitism, against homophobia, racism, against Islamophobia, and all forms of hatred and bigotry. We were especially pleased that young people throughout Germany joined us in communicating that in the face of cruelty, silence is not golden. Silence is complicity. Then, as now, there was a need for urgency. In 2003, word leaked that Germany's far-right AfD party had a plan, should it come into power, for mass deportation of asylum seekers and German citizens with immigrant origins. In reaction, millions across Germany, including in towns in the former East, peacefully rallied in protest. While the AfD had been rapidly on the rise, its support declined after the rallies. Although rallies won't suffice, they signal that citizens care enough to stand publicly against spreading extremism. These kinds of signals of civic courage motivate sympathetic others to act. There's actually good neuroscience evidence that it gets people to act on what they value by seeing other people with whom they can bond stand up and speak out peacefully. Since 2024, the US presidential election, I have focused on how Americans distressed by ascendant extremism can forge productive ways forward. Drawing from lessons learned from democratic theory and practice, the rise of extremism in Europe and over the past century, and in the US, and hands-on international diplomacy, I diagnosed 3 proximate causes that distressed Americans need to counter to move forward beyond our current crisis. You will notice as I talk about these that they're not unique to America, but they are ascendant in America. The 3 Ds are the proximate causes that can cripple and even end democracy, and they are demagoguery, disinformation, and distrust. You will note these causes are neither new nor unique to the United States, yet their rise in American democracy today to the top political office in our country imminently threatens the freedom and security not just of the US, but also of our European allies and other democracies. They challenge the entire rule-based international order that has brought unprecedented prosperity, peace, and social and scientific advancement over the course of the past 8 decades. I start with the D at the top, demagoguery. So democratically elected demagogues gain power through emotional appeal to citizens' anger and resentment of allies. This phenomenon goes back, in my field in political theory, at least as far as Plato's Republic, Book 9. Democracy declines when a charismatic extremist is elected who demonizes all opposition. If not effectively opposed, President Trump could lead American democracy down this road to self-destruction. He enjoins his most loyal followers to call political opponents enemies of the people and to treat them that way. He threatens violence and he celebrates cruelty as the world witnessed on January 6th, 2021, when Trump's avid followers, with his encouragement, stormed the Capitol, assaulted police officers, and tried to harm and even kill people who were carrying out their sworn duty to the Constitution in certifying the results of the 2020 presidential election. Subsequently, an independent judiciary tried and convicted leaders of the plot of seditious conspiracy, and the assailants were convicted of lesser crimes. True to the prototype of a demagogue, after regaining power, Trump rewarded the seditious conspirators and assailants for putting loyalty to him above the law. Among his most dangerous acts as president to date was granting them all presidential pardons. These pardons encouraged vigilantes to be loyal to the president and unaccountable to civil authorities, reinforcing belief in the preeminence of power and fealty to the man who wields it. The pardons turned the truth of an attempted insurrection into the lie that, in Trump's words, while murderers don't even go to jail in this country, these were people that actually love our country, end quote. A key to understanding the distinctive danger of demagogues is that their modus operandi goes beyond lying. There's a technical term, a technical philosophical term of their modus operandi, their MO. And it was precisely defined by the philosopher Harry Frankfurt in his unlikely bestseller. Harry was a dear friend, and he wrote an essay that Princeton University Press then made into a book, and it became a bestseller, and it was untitled On Bullshit. Liars, Frankfurt observed, at least pay homage to the truth by consciously flouting it. Bullshitters pay truth no regard whatsoever. So Trump, posting on Truth Social, calls Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky a dictator. When asked a week later by a reporter whether he still believed this, Trump replies, "Did I say that? I can't believe I said that." Next question. Demagogic bullshitting in democratic politics is so dangerous because its all-consuming self-absorption blocks the very conception of truth-telling. This brings me to the second D of our democratic crisis, disinformation. All of us are vulnerable to confirmation bias. We rely on information that supports our own biases, even when it is incorrect or a half-truth. Misinformation encompasses ordinary beliefs. We think we know, but it isn't true. Demagoguery goes dangerously beyond spreading misinformation, trafficking in readily known lies. Disinformation. Disinformation is the jet fuel of demagoguery today, incentivizing authoritarians to deluge democracies with it through cyber technologies that move bullshit at breakneck speed across communities. Just one of many examples comes from the 2024 presidential campaign, targeting vulnerable Haitian immigrants. 2 months prior to the election, candidate Trump pronounced in a widely watched debate with candidate Harris, and I quote, "They're eating the dogs. The people that came in, they're eating the cats. They're eating the pets of the people that live there, and this is what's happening in our country," end quote. Police and elected officials in Springfield, Ohio, where the claim originated, confirmed that there was not an iota of evidence or truth to the charge, which had its origins in a crank internet posting from weeks earlier. But facts are beside the point to a demagogue's demonizing, self-aggrandizing logic. It's important to recognize that. All of which leads to the third D, distrust. Confidence in government, the media, schools, colleges, and universities, the judiciary, religious, and other institutions has declined. In some cases to historic lows over the past decade. And there's been a long secular decline over decades, but the last decade has seen even more. In many instances, colleges and universities are a prime example. Levels of distrust also divide sharply along partisan lines. For all of us, this should be a dire warning, what Americans call a 4-alarm fire. Public trust is the currency of organizations, and it's essential to building political power, to keeping political power in check, most especially in a democracy. Pervasive distrust creates fertile ground for demagogues to sow disinformation. They do so with one goal: to neuter any institutions that can serve on a check on their power, their wealth, or their popularity. Legal verdicts count for nothing unless judges, juries, and members of other institutions with countervailing powers to the chief executive can do their jobs. This is why the demagogue loses no time in attacking them. It is should not be to anybody surprising that one of the first things that demagogues go after are the books, the institutions that teach with freedom of speech and inquiry, the journalists that publish with freedom of press, and the jurists and judges who abide by the rule of law. Observe Trump's professed enemies: the judiciary, the press, colleges and universities, whose core mission are discerning facts, searching for evidence, preserving, creating, and publicly distributing knowledge. Among the most destructive distrusts of all is the current administration's degradation of America's long-standing allies and alliances. Trump's biggest and earliest target was NATO, the strongest defense alliance in recorded history, from which the first Trump administration threatened to withdraw. Never mind that after 9/11, NATO lost no time in invoking its members' Article 5 commitment to the mutual defense of the United States. Now, in the second Trump administration, all US allies have become prime targets as Trump focuses on what he calls the most beautiful word in the dictionary: tariffs. Trump's approach to imposing tariffs is a case study in the destructive potential of demagoguery, disinformation, and distrust. In the making. So I will give you a mini case study here. And it's in the making, right? So after announcing historically high tariffs on America's allies and adversaries, Trump watched the stock market plummet and the interest rates on US Treasuries soar. It was the start of the loss of confidence in the US dollar. But his administration shows no deep commitment other than to his desires, which are notoriously fickle. Within a week, there came an announced 90-day pause on the tariffs, reducing them to 10%, still historically high. Meanwhile, Trump doubled down on tariffs for China, raising them to 145%. After President for Life Xi raised Chinese tariffs, Trump backed down. And in another just daily example of bullshit, he claimed it was the success of the art of the deal. No deal had been made. Leading by threat and devaluing trust, even among allies, has sowed hostility from former friends, no major concessions from arch rivals, and dangerous uncertainty in the dollar and once solid markets. The message throughout is quite simple, and it's as dangerous as it is simple. My might makes right. Without a shared currency of trust or truth, only by pleasing or posing a credible threat to the leader's power, wealth, or popularity will he back down. Demagoguery, disinformation, and distrust. Although these are three proximate causes of American democracy in distress today, one of the main points I want to make is that any effective strategy to reverse this existential threat to democracy must address deeper and broader causes. So why? Because these three proximate causes are quite insidious. And by insidious, I mean that they are unusually resistant to direct attack. Frontal assaults on them often fail, and in some cases unintentionally backfire. So how so? A demagogue, by his charismatic nature, has an uncommonly dedicated following. So harping on his vices can serve to strengthen the commitment of his loyal base. As for disinformation, we must quickly counter dangerous falsehoods to limit their spread. But due to confirmation bias, repeating fake facts, even if only to counter them, can unintentionally spread and deepen the hold of disinformation. There is strong evidence of this. Again, we need to increase confidence in distrusted institutions that serve as countervailing powers, but touting their trustworthiness is not the solution, because institutions that were not trustworthy would also claim that they were trustworthy. We must show that they serve the public good. We can't just say it. So today, I want to suggest in the rest of my talk 3 strategies which serve the public good and by which we can more effectively defend American democracy. And I think, again, these apply to other democracies in distress, but ideally doing this even before they're in the distress that we are in America. And the 3 strategies happen to be 3 E's, following the 3 D's: the economy, education, and ethics. And I will take one at a time. And they all aim at delivering clear results for the people democracy must serve to survive. So American democracy needs to effectively address rising economic inequality and insecurity, the backsliding of educational opportunity, and eroding ethical norms. And while these take time to fully implement, they also provide great opportunities for collective communication and action now. We must begin, I believe, by publicly acknowledging the well-grounded sense of many Americans that government does not work well for them, and hasn't for quite some time. Long-term trends, growth of economic inequality, and a declining sense of social standing among the working and middle classes creates strong anti-incumbency sentiment among many citizens. This sentiment has parallels throughout European democracy, where economic insecurity also prevails. So the first E antidote, the economy, calls for more public acknowledgement and political action. Over 5 decades, the American rich have become much richer. The rich and the poor have both become a larger share of Americans. So here's some facts. Between the rich and the poor, the American middle class has shrunk, falling from 61% to 51% of American households between 1971 and 2023. The middle class has become a bare majority of Americans, a trend that cannot sustain democracy. Deindustrialization has worsened economic disparities. The trends of lost middle-income jobs and raging inequalities leave the U.S. in urgent need to improve job opportunities without exploding consumer prices. For most Americans to gain confidence that democracy works for them, because democracy is a very abstract term for most people. I've worked on democracy my whole life, and because of my father, I understand viscerally what it means. But for most people, they need to see that the government supports economic security for them, meaning for the working and middle classes. Well-paying jobs, along with affordable health care and housing in safe communities. Most people want and they need that, and they deserve that. Tariffs raise prices. That's the one certain thing about tariffs. They raise prices. And they place the greatest burden on lower income individuals and families. Subsidies can both grow good jobs and support small businesses in green industries, for example. And by contrast to tariffs, subsidies are paid through taxes, placing less burden on lower income individuals. So that's just one example in the economy. There are many, many more. I don't have time to go into deep policy, but happy to take your reactions and questions on any of this. The second E antidote, education, is a matter of making high-quality education affordable to all Americans, and transparently so. Most Americans now think that college is not worth the cost. The tuition, room, and board of many American colleges are so high, and their net costs after factoring in financial aid are so opaque, unlike in most of other democracies, the net cost that a middle and low income family would pay are so opaque that a PhD doesn't suffice to understand them. They really need a transparent cost calculator to understand what you would pay if you were a middle income family. Yet high school graduates today earn tens of thousands less per year than college graduates in the US, and they also have a lifespan that is a staggering 9 years shorter. This at the very time the Trump administration is targeting the nation's schools, colleges, and universities with funding cuts and tax increases. In addition to making higher education more clearly affordable, the US would do well to follow the lead of many European countries and offer apprenticeship pathways to the skilled trades of today and the future. Dual-track programs combine job training with relevant college courses. They can open well-paying jobs and secure career pathways to young people while also reducing economic inequality. So they have a dual, their primary function is to give young people for whom 4 years of college isn't the best thing for a lot of young people. They can give them an alternative of having a really good career and at the same time helping to lower the disparities in the economy. And then there's the matter in my country of educational quality. Civics education has declined so much over the decades that most secondary schools in the US offer none today, no civic education. It used to be an average of 3 courses, now the average is 0, weakening the democratic quality of public schooling. The stability of democracies depends on laying the educational foundations for well-informed citizens who have long-term economic opportunities. So that brings me to the third E, ethics. You might think of it as an ethos, because it's ethics writ large. Specifically, the urgent need to recall and reclaim the basic ethical norms of democracy. So earlier I noted how daunting are the challenges to American democracy today. There are no simple solutions at hand. But there are starting points, places where we can begin to put things right. And ethics is one such place, and a big place at that. So I conclude with a suggested beginning. And I go from a small place, the back seat of an Audi, to a large place, which is the ethos which we occupy and we help create in our democracies. So here's my suggested beginning. Born like Isaiah Berlin in Riga in the early 20th century, the political philosopher Judith Shklar, who went by Dita, she was one of my dissertation advisors, singled out cruelty as the greatest of all political vices. Not just democracy, but civilization itself dies when cruelty dominates politics. Ordinary people become complicit in cruelty by their silence, even when speaking out and standing up against it would not be all that costly. Hannah Arendt famously labeled the erosion of resistance to the Nazis as the banality of evil. She understood that in the absence of sufficient resistance, cruelty becomes both normalized and rewarded. Trump's rallies and rhetoric have normalized cruelty, and his pardoning of the January 6th rioters has rewarded it. Demagogues publicly often appear to delight themselves and their most avid supporters in exuding and exalting cruelty. This presents a practical strategy once we recognize that the ever-aspiring demagogue's base of power is not a monolith. While demagogues have enthusiasts, they typically also have many enablers. It will not just be the enthusiasts, but the enablers who decide whether and how a democracy survives. There is overwhelming evidence of this. It will be the otherwise kind German family who treated my father well, but nonetheless raised their arms in Nazi salute, perhaps out of fear, but clearly in deference as the parade went by. At this moment, too few civil society leaders and organizations in the US are standing up to defend the most fundamental democratic values and interests. Too few are naming and denouncing cruelty. Among the early signs of trouble arose in national journalism. Two major American newspaper owners, Jeff Bezos and Patrick Soon-Shiong, blocked their editorial boards from endorsing a candidate for president in the 2024 election. This, after one of those candidates had already channeled the worst tyrants in modern history, labeling his domestic opponents, quote, enemies from within, and the press as enemies of the American people. And that was just the beginning. The owners of major television networks settled, rather than litigated, clear legal cases for fear of what more the Trump administration would do to them. And then two of the largest law firms settled, rather than litigated, potentially winnable cases. Many more followed, not wanting to lose some of their top, earning, corporate-oriented lawyers and clients. All of this was driven by bottom-line calculations and internal competition among the firms themselves, rather than by the public interest that these firms profess and professionally should serve. A courageous few law firms are standing up for their rights and, consistent with their professional duty and ability, are litigating. At the same time, the Trump administration threatened to withdraw billions of dollars in research support, mostly in the sciences and medicine, from prominent American universities, demanding ideological conditions for reinstating withdrawn funds. Columbia University was an early target, ostensibly because of some truly troubling anti-Semitic actions on its campus. It did not take long before the government's demands went far beyond addressing anti-Semitism to changing student admissions and international recruiting and placing academic departments under receivership. Some university presidents and a group of former university presidents promptly spoke out against the government's demands. They defended the rule of law and academic freedom, the fundamental public value of universities. Most initially did not. When the Trump administration escalated its demands against Harvard University to an unprecedented level, its president, Alan Garber, responded quickly, rejecting their proposal. He said, "The university will not surrender its independence or relinquish its constitutional rights." Not only did the same set of current and former university presidents at once support this refusal to capitulate, but soon hundreds more spoke out in staunch support, as did the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, more often a critic of Harvard than not, but in staunch support of what President Garber did. History cannot be clearer. In the face of lawlessness and cruelty silenced by civic leaders, those who are the enablers, not the enthusiasts, signals the demise of democracy. Silence erodes the human decency of democracy. Without the decency to oppose lawlessness and cruelty, when no great sacrifice is required, the worst cruelties, profound evils, slowly but surely find fertile grounds for growth. The stage is then set for making it truly costly and dangerous to speak truth to power. And so, my theoretical underpinnings come to call and to rely also upon my practical experiences. My relationship with Germany is bookended by two moments. 90 years ago, an ordinary, seemingly kind German family raised their arms in Nazi salute. Just 2 years ago, millions of ordinary Germans took to the streets in solidarity against lawlessness, hatred, and cruelty. From this, my message: the time has come for civic courage. Standing strong for our common bonds of humanity, defending equal rights for partisan opponents, not countenancing the idea that law-abiding citizens, visitors, immigrants, and allies are enemies. This is our moment of choosing. A moment that calls for colleges and universities, the judiciary and journalism to stand strong for freedom of inquiry, the pursuit of truth, and the rule of law. A moment that calls for more than countering demagoguery, disinformation, and distrust, however important that is, and it is important, but also supporting economic, educational, and ethical changes that will demonstrably serve most citizens. The future of democracy will depend upon our standing together, not to salute the passing parade, but to show respect for others, and the civic courage to stand up and speak out for truth, freedom, and democratic decency. There is no time to spare.
Thank you very much indeed. We do have time for questions, so if anyone had points or questions they wish to make, please do raise your hand. And then we've got a gentleman here. Let's pass a microphone to this gentleman down here.
We have been watching, I think, for the last 15 to 20 years, like the buildup of these fake news machines, basically via social media, the wider internet, maybe by the right-wing populists or demagogues. And we were, like, researchers, let's say, uncovered some of the mechanisms, but many of the political parties or the mainstream parties, they were not really doing anything against it. Like copying it would probably destroy democracy even more. But my question is like, how can we take back that space or push back those fake news machines?
It's a really very important question to ask. There is no way, I believe, of getting rid of that consistent with freedom of press and speech and so on. So there's only, but importantly, a way of using the speed of communication now to respond quickly. So, for example, at my university, at the Annenberg School for Communication, originated decades ago an institution called factcheck.org, which was the first, and now it spread. So there are a lot of very quick fact-checking. And that's really important. I don't want to say that that's not incredibly important. It's what philosophers would say a necessary but not sufficient condition. The problem, as I said, is when you have fake news out there and enthusiasts who have confirmation bias who will accept it, just countering that is not going to be enough. But you have to counter it quickly. A good example of something that wasn't countered quickly is probably the most dangerous single scientific article published in modern history was when Lancet published the article, which turned out to be a fraudulent article that linked vaccines with autism, right? And the belief that vaccines cause autism immediately went viral. And this was decades ago, mind you. And countering it, now there's massive evidence to counter it, and turned out the author was actually, it was a fraudulent study. It still has not been able to counter, and we have a secretary of, Health and Human Services who believes the stuff. And so the answer is we have to really continue to fund things. Not funding, for example, Radio Free Europe is another real problem. But countering it alone won't be enough. You have to also address the conditions of educating people so they're more alert to the fact of fake news.
The problem seems like, I think 50% of the people do not consume, let's say, normal media anymore, right? You don't even reach them anymore.
Yeah, so, and look, we all live in information bubbles, and the bubbles have just become more exclusive over time. But countering it is very important, and the single biggest long-term and short-term antidote to this is education. I mean, that is to prime people to be skeptical, which is what we do in education. And civic education is supposed to teach people to argue civilly and to question whether something is a fact. And we have to do a better job of that. That's that's the deeper cause that needs to be addressed, and we can't, again, afford not to do that while we do all of the other more, treating the symptoms more. Yeah.
I think we had a question down here, did we?
There.
No. In which case, Jack, did you have a question?
No,
oh, behind you, okay.
If I may ask a domestic question for you, where is the Democratic Party?
Look, the United States is that isn't a question I can ask as simply as you can. I can answer as simply as you can ask it. The Democratic Party is. Because we have a two-party system and we don't have a parliamentary system, the Democratic Party exists at the local, state level as well as the national level. And in my state of Pennsylvania, we have a governor from the Democratic Party, Josh Shapiro, and he has a set of values and interests that he puts forward. The Democratic Party right now, you will not see it as a unified entity at the national level until we get much closer to the next election.
And I guess you could say that is a challenge to the democratic structure of the US, because it is hard for one party, an opposition party, to hold a current administration to account in the way that it can be done elsewhere.
That's true. I mean, if you look at how unified the Democratic Party is in Congress, it's very unified, but that's not a sign of the health of our democracy, right? Because the Republicans are very unified behind the president. So it is a fact. This is something I teach, I'll just give a very short, because so Alexis de Tocqueville wrote this wonderful tome, Democracy in America, and what really struck him is even more true today, and the health of American democracy is how many associations bloom. We have enormous number of associations, and that's even true for the Democratic Party. It exists in many different forms, in local, state, as well as national. And the freedom of association, as long as associations remain free, is what should give us, that in our Constitution should give us hope and give me hope for democracy. I am not despairing. I am just absolutely intent on doing everything I can do and encouraging other people to join in doing everything they can do to stand up and speak out now. It doesn't need one of two parties to do that. And I would dare say that right now, anybody who came out of the Democratic Party and said, and made it clear that she or he were running for president in 2028 would just be like a big bullseye, would just have a lot of darts thrown at them. So I think it's the flourishing of associations that show civic courage and stay true to their mission that's going to get us through this very distressing and difficult period.
We've got time for maybe two more. So the lady just here.
Thank you very much indeed. You've touched on this in many different respects, but when the idea of free speech is being weaponized, and we know this is happening particularly with regard to universities and campuses, what would be your medicine for a kind of, for protecting and defending responsible free speech?
Well, I think your question had the answer in it. I'll just expand a little. We have to defend it. We have to defend it. We have to be very articulate in defending it. We have to be very staunch in defending it. And we also have to make clear what the limit, that free speech, as John Stuart Mill famously said, doesn't mean falsely shouting fire in a crowded theater. It doesn't mean threatening people with violence. It doesn't mean harassing. But free speech is the lifeblood not only of universities, but of democracies. And we have to be very clear in defending that. Free speech, which has a subset of it in academic life, academic freedom. And that's why when that attack just started, that's why I and other former university presidents, as well as now some significant current university presidents, stood up and spoke out. There is no alternative but to do that. And we need other institutions working with us too, because universities don't have a lot of political power by our very nature. We will not, despite the Orwellian charges of universities indoctrinating, that's the last thing we do. And what we do is encourage debate. I want to give just one example from my experience as a university president. So what struck me most when I traveled around the world as the university president is the single question I got asked most when I went to countries that are authoritarian countries, and I spoke at a university there, and I spoke freely, of course, as an American. The single question I almost always got as the first question is, how do you teach creativity? Because we are famous around the world, we colleges and universities and democracy, for teaching creativity. And that, if you take my first E, economic, that is our single greatest source of economic prosperity, is the creativity and innovation from everything from medicine and science to arts and culture.
So one last question right up here at the end, if we can.
Hi. The clown who currently occupies the Oval Office has spoken, I don't know whether it's seriously or half seriously, about a third term. Are the institutions within the US strong enough to prevent that from happening? And you
Prevent what from happening?
From the idea of a third term for Trump.
Third term.
Oh, so yes. But not, I mean, look, again, it won't happen automatically that people will have to use human agency, but I would not bet against the US upholding the Constitution in this case. I will bet for it, and there will be a lot of, it will be very important. Let me just say that that's a great, I mean, if that's the last question, I'm very, I would say otherwise if I thought it would go the other way. But that alone is not going to save, make American democracy, what American democracy can and should be. But it's a very good question to end on, because that is, if there is one signal that American democracy is dead, it would be that. But don't, don't bet against us on this. But do help us with your voices as well. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much indeed, everyone. And if people wish to, we are having drinks outside. If you wanted to join us for drinks, that's fine as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's so funny how in this world you get lots of... we're all obsessed. I mean, you're obsessed, but we're obsessed.